There is a tale they no longer teach in classrooms, one smothered in the dust of denial and sealed beneath centuries of marble. But if you lean close enough to the bones of the Colosseum and listen beyond the screams of lions and the clash of steel, you might still hear it, the whisper of blood not just spilled, but drunk. This story begins not with kings, but with convulsions. Son of a well-off merchant, his fits began when he was 12, during a religious festival on the Palatine Hill. One moment, he was laughing at a juggler. The next, he collapsed into violent spasms. They paid the best physicians, Galenic minds trained in humors and leeches. They gave him nettle roots, burned toads, even amulets soaked in goat bile. His mouth foamed, his eyes rolled back, and for the briefest flicker of time, he spoke in tongues no Roman priest could translate. In the shadowed alleys of ancient Rome, amid the cracked mosaics and lingering smoke from temple fires, there were the epileptics. They were feared, whispered about, hidden behind cloaks, or chained in their homes. The Romans called their affliction morbus commissulus, the sacred disease, sacred. In the dim corridor beneath the great Colosseum, a cup was filled, because it was thought to be a curse or a message from the gods. Rusted along the edges, warmed by the sun, not because he wanted to, but because his father forced him. And in that moment, not just in one family, but across an empire built on spectacle and superstition, if it worked once, it could work again. No one asked what beneath that brutal city of gods and gold. The line between survival and sacrifice blurred forever. No one dared to ask was whether the men dying above knew what their essence was becoming. If a boy stopped shaking for even a day, blood, fresh, human, spilled not just for sport, but for healing. Wasn't that proof? The metallic tang of death slipped down his throat like a sacrament. They say his eyes cleared, that the tremor in his hands stopped, that for 3 days he was at peace, trembling slightly in the hands of a man too desperate to care about the gods. Inside it swirled the blood of Cassius Ferox once, a Thracian prince, now a chain killer with 32 victories, and a final breath drawn only seconds earlier, a punishment, or worse, a sign of divine possession. One of these souls was a boy named Lucius Calvus. From that day on, he was marked. His mother prayed, his father wept, though never in public. Nothing worked. Until one day, a slave girl named Thysphorin, Nubian, superstitious, spoke of a practice older than Rome itself. Her people, she said, believed that the life force of the strong could banish the spirits of the weak, and the strongest of all were men who danced with death, gladiators. She wasn't alone in this belief. By the time Lucius turned 15, the rumor had already slithered into Roman elite circles like a serpent into a sleeping child's cradle. Gladiator, blood still warm, taken fresh from the throat or stomach, was said to possess power. Power to calm the storming brain, to restore balance to the humors, to drive out the demons that twisted limbs and silenced voices. One dusky morning, it was an iron bowl. Lucius drank it. He drank greedily, 3 days. Then the fits returned worse than before. But the hope had been born, and so began the darkest ritual of Rome. Not one carved into temple stone or recited in senate halls, but whispered behind silk curtains and carried out in the dirt beneath the arena. What they were not just martyrs for entertainment. They were medicine, and somewhere, the gladiator who bled for Lucius Calvus had a name, Cassius Ferox, in Thrace. He had once ridden beneath banners embroidered with wolves, a free prince with a voice like thunder and eyes the color of frozen rivers. Rome had stolen his freedom, his sword, even his tongue. But in death, it gave him purpose again, though not one he would have chosen. After his blood was consumed, a dozen epileptics were brought to the games. Wealthy families, veiled wives, shrouded sons, each one seated close to the arena floor, not for sport, but for proximity. Some said the spirit still clung to the tissue, that the fight remained in the flesh, and that by consuming it, the sick might inherit the strength. Damn, the more violent the death, the more potent the cure. When a gladiator died, slaves would scramble beneath the corpse with silver goblets and clay flasks, collecting the still warm essence before it cooled. Then, with urgency and trembling reverence, they would bring it to the sick. They began to call him the healer, not in reverence, but in secret, in murmurs. They documented the results, wrote scrolls about the properties of vita sanguinis, the life in the blood, and recommended the ideal timing, temperature, and even the age of the fighter for maximum benefit. Young gladiators were preferred, strong, unbroken by disease. Men who had bled only in battle, never in bed, sip a swallow, prayer. Those condemned to death were now seen not merely as expendable but useful. If they could no longer fight, they could still serve one final act, one final extraction. At first it was only the blood, but soon it was the liver, the heart, the lungs. The more vital, the better. Seizures came under the moonlight, when shadows grew long and oil lamps flickered like spirits. They knew what awaited them if they lost. Death was no longer the end. It was an invasion, a harvesting. Their bodies were no longer their own. She was delicate, always draped in silk, her wrists wrapped in gold cords to keep her hands from clawing her own skin during fits. Her father was a stoic, a man of logic, but desperation turns marble into wax. What a cruel irony for those forced to die. He saw the nobles lean forward when a fighter collapsed, not in admiration, but in expectation. The crowd cheered, but it was not joy. It was hunger, not for spectacle, for sustenance. As his life ebbed from his wrists, physicians stood by with glass vessels, collecting every drop. He saw the physicians sharpening blades before the battle had even begun. If survival depended not on virtue, but on feeding from the dying, the empire still stood but the soul of it, that had begun to rot. There was a girl, Marcella, daughter of a senator, beautiful but broken. His heart was still beating when it was handed to Marcella's nursemaid, who sliced it open with a sharpened bone and pressed the flesh to the girl's lips. He paid for a private execution. No crowd, no cheers. Just one man condemned to die in silence, his hands bound, eyes wide, as the physician's knife made its quiet descent. A sound ancient and raw, filled with a pain no remedy could heal. Marcella lived another year, and so the rituals deepened. What had begun as whispered superstition became almost sacred. Physicians no longer scoffed. It became a quiet industry, shadowing the larger engine of Roman blood sport. Promoters began to sell access to the dying. Gladiators' final breath became a currency. But not all were willing. Some fought harder, desperately, not just to survive, but to avoid becoming a remedy. And among them rose a voice, one that would change everything. His name was Drusus, a Gaul by blood, taken as a child, raised in the ludus, Magnus-like livestock among blades. He was different. He watched, listened, understood. And one day, after 24 victories over a rival and refused to deliver the final blow, he looked to the emperor's box and spat. That act of defiance sealed his fate. He was sentenced to death, not by lions, not by fire, but by bleeding. A slow, draining, public, deliberate. They called it purification, but Drusus had already made his mark. In that final moment, with his last breath, he screamed a curse not in Latin, but in the guttural howl of his mother tongue. And for the first time the crowd grew quiet. What had they become? What did it mean to be Roman? Beneath the golden statues and towering arches, something had shifted. After the execution of Drusus, something unspoken began to fester beneath Rome's white marble skin. His curse, flung into the sky like blood on a priest's robe, clung to the city's breath. The next morning, a rumor passed through the Subura like smoke. The amphitheater had been defiled. That the blood drained from Drusus turned black before it was even caught. That the physicians' hands trembled as the goblets cracked in their palms. But Rome is a city that feeds on denial. By noon, Senator's wife drank that same cursed blood, sweetened with date syrup to mask the bitterness, and declared herself healed of melancholy. The practice did not wane, it evolved. The rich began to keep private gladiators, not for sport, but for blood. The streets swelled with orphans and lepers, with mothers whispering desperate prayers as their children seized in the dirt. They could not afford gladiator blood, but they could listen, and they could imitate. She wandered from town to town, claiming visions from Mars himself. Her ritual was grotesque. A black bull bled onto a marble altar, then mixed with the hair of a virgin and a feather from a bird struck by lightning. locked in basements, trained not to fight, but to suffer. Their value no longer lay in showmanship, but in purity. Unspoiled flesh, unsullied by vice. Bled only under the lunar calendar or the blessing of certain gods. Physicians grew more ambitious, combining the blood with crushed pearls, powdered emerald, even molten gold in minute doses. His father, a poor stonecutter, sold his tools and his wedding ring for a single cup of blood. But it was not gladiator blood. It came from a captured thief, barely dead, dumped in a cart behind the arena like a torn sandal. These were no longer remedies. His eyes burst vessels like crushed berries. By morning, he was dead, his body twisted, jaw locked in a final grimace of terror. His mother, struck mad with grief, carried his corpse to the forum and laid it at the foot of the temple of Saturn. She tore her garments, beat her chest, and shouted for justice, not from men, but from the gods. Some mixed wine with pig's blood. Others harvested it from criminals in secret executions. There were even whispers of graver robbers draining the corpses of soldiers still warm from war. There were sacraments. And as the upper classes drank, the lower classes starved. Soon, counterfeit healers emerged, charlatans who slit the throats of animals in alleyways and sold the steaming red to the desperate as blessed essence, but in fear. What if the soul was not at peace? What if it was angry? One such healer was a woman named Aaliyah, once a priestess of Vesta, now cast out for sleeping with a slave. People drank, and some claimed they were cured. Even then, it must be boiled with lavender and honey, public, in the Senate. Fringe cult dedicated to Mithras, the god born from stone and lover of sacrifice, began hosting. Midnight ceremonies where nobles knelt beneath a slotted grate while a bull was slain above them, its blood raining down like crimson baptism. They believed it washed sin away, that it granted second sight, that it kept death at bay. Blessed with prayers, given by physicians who wore veils and carried ivory staffs. But not all drank willingly. It was the boy Felix who changed everything. Society of parasites feeding on the veins of its own despair. Felix was 8 when his seizures began. Felix drank, screamed for 7 hours. His skin blistered. The people listened. Something inside them, long silent, began to shift. Not in revulsion of the blood rituals. No, not yet. They began to wonder. If blood held power to heal, could it also poison if the soul clung to the fluid? From that moment, new precautions emerged. Blood was to be taken only with specific chance. Only from men who had died honorably. Only when the omens birds, stars and trails lined. The rituals, once barbaric, now resembled religion. Some temples even began to incorporate blood drinking into their rites. Rome, the eternal city, had birthed a new gospel. And in its pages, written not in ink but in gore, every citizen played a role. The sick, the hopeful, the condemned. But the gods, even the Roman ones, do not suffer abominations forever. Storms came. Plague whispered through aqueducts like serpents. And on the 7th month of that year, the emperor's own nephew, cured once by gladiator blood, began seizing again. He died with his mouth full of iron. It was said the gods had withdrawn their blessing. Perhaps they had never given it at all. As the empire's veins pulsed slower, as its breath turned ragged beneath the marble mask of eternity, the silence that followed the boy's death grew heavier than the roar of 1,000 amphitheaters. The emperor, old, bloated, shadowed by paranoia, ordered an inquiry. Not into medicine, into superstition. His scholars scoured the archives of Alexandria, seeking forgotten formulas, lost gods, buried truths. His augurs tore open birds each dawn, looking for patterns in the rot. His priests fasted, dreaming of divine instruction. And when all else failed, he turned to the last thing Rome had not yet devoured. In secret chambers beneath the Palatine, children were gathered mute, pale, chosen from orphans, slaves, the unwanted, were starved, then fed, then starved again, then offered warm blood. From those who still writhed as they bled. Children, they were pure, unbloodied by war or wine. Their dreams were said to echo the whispers of the divine. They called it infusio, animi, the infusion of soul. None survived. There, among columns of white marble and cold winds that howled like the ghosts of gladiators past, he waited for deliverance, not the children, not those who fed them. Even the scribes who witnessed the rituals clawed out their own eyes in time. The emperor, sensing doom, fled to his summer villa on Capri. It never came. He died face down in his bath, water tinged red not with blood, but with crushed hibiscus, mistaken by a servant for healing tonic, that when you drink of the fallen, you inherit not only their strength, but their sins. They buried him in silence, no coins placed on his eyes, no blood spilled in tribute. Now they say, it fell the moment it crossed that final threshold. Rome began to forget. A new generation of physicians, rose-Greeked, taught, skeptical, colder. It would be banned in his own lifetime, preserved only in fragments, hidden in monastic libraries beneath stone and silence. They labeled blood rituals archaic, unclean, unfitting for enlightened minds. Temples no longer offered blood as blessing, and more of the one who bled. I no longer know where I end and where the dead begin. The cults were pushed to the outskirts, then underground, then into myth. Slowly, as the years dragged forward like a dying ox, the practice diminished not by decree, but by fear. Too many had died. Too few had been saved. But myths never truly die. Whispers remained. In back rooms of apothecaries, old women still murmured that blood holds memory, that in every drop lies a name. And listen, he wandered the streets barefoot, flinching at the sound of water poured into cups, weeping at the scent of iron on the wind. And some those who look too long into the eyes of the arena wood say that Rome did not fall from war, nor famine, nor betrayal. When it turned healing into hunger, when it carved medicine from murder, when it drank from the wounds of men and called it divine, in time, Lucius Calvus would grow into a man. He would write a single book, De Sanguinis Virtute, on the power of blood. In its final page, he writes, I drank, I was healed, and I drank again. And in every cup, I felt less of myself. It is said that before he died, Lucius stopped speaking. He had become a chalice too full to carry. And in the cracked silence of his life, Rome heard its own echo. So now, when you visit the Colosseum and you walk where sand once mixed with blood, lean close, not to the stones, for it is still there, a heartbeat. Not your own, not anymore.